Power Talks, empowering you through the voice of truth with your host, Dr. Joel Hunter.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Joel Hunter, host of Power Talks, empowering you through the voice of truth. On today's program, we will hear from Pat Morley, who's the founder and executive chairman of Man in the Mirror Ministries, an international men's ministry, and Brett Clemmer, the president and CEO of Man in the Mirror. We're looking forward to seeing what these two great leaders of the Christian community have to say to us about men's ministry. This is I love being able to talk about this. This is my first time having a program specific to men's ministries. Pat, let me start out with you. You're an icon in this community. And so I want to know, I read at one point, you started off in real estate developer, at one point owned like 59 companies or were partners or in leadership, and then made this huge turn toward ministry. Tell us a little bit about the story of that.
No, my first career was real estate, but my story really starts a long time before that, when I had that false narrative that my parents, that everything that was wrong in my life was my parents' fault, as a lot of young people do. And I basically was taking that out on my wife, Patsy, as a newlywed, and trying to make money, and turned out I was pretty good at that. But what I found was the more money I made, the less satisfied that I was. So exact opposite of what I thought. And I really began to hate my life, just like Solomon in Ecclesiastes. And so, maybe a long story for another time, but we ended up going to a church here in town. It was Asbury Methodist Church.
Oh, there you go.
And Jesus Christ approached me lovingly and caringly through some men in that church. One man, Jim Gillian, in particular, took me under his wing and began to teach me what it meant to be a godly man, a godly husband, and a godly father. Wow. And I ate it up. I mean, basically, he said things to me that I'd never heard before, or if I'd heard them, I didn't connect. And it just sort of unchained something inside of me, and I really felt like I had been set free. And so I just thought it was the greatest news, the gospel, that I had ever heard, still do, and I couldn't wait to tell all my buddies. So what happened was I started taking all my friends to lunch and say, hey, you're not going to believe what's been going on in my life. And I was Mr. Excitement anyway, maybe sometimes. And so I would tell them about it, and they would become excited too. And they would say, well, how can I do that too? And so I would lead them to Jesus. And then we had all these guys coming to Christ and didn't know what to do with them. So we started a Bible study. And then we did a lot of other things. The Thanksgiving Leadership Prayer Breakfast, which you've been part of, the 40-year tradition in this town. And then we started the Man in the Mirror Bible Study 33 years ago. We celebrated our 33rd anniversary this past Friday. And so anyway, that's kind of the genesis of it.
So I've got to ask you this. You are the classic overachiever. I mean,
you think?
Oh my gosh. This, with, educationally, PhD, graduate work, Harvard, Oxford, seminary degree from RTS, created this ministry that eventually has touched 12 million people worldwide. Yeah. I love to tell the story about when I was in China and I saw your book on the bestseller rack in one of the few Christian bookstores in China, and there's Pat Morley's Man in the Mirror. I took a picture of it and sent it back to you. But did you ever, I know you were a visionary, but did you ever see that this Man in the Mirror ministry would be this worldwide and affect this many people? I mean, equipping 35,000 churches to do ministry to men and so on. So did you ever see that?
Yeah, sure. I planned it all out.
Good to know. All right. That's all I wanted to know.
No, I mean, I'm clueless. I'm a real estate developer down here in Central Florida. I mean, who would have ever guessed? It's a little embarrassing, too, because I kind of think of myself as being a pretty decent visionary planner kind of a guy. But really, the word that I would use to describe my experience is passenger. I mean, I have no idea how we got here, and I have no idea where we're going either. Yeah. We have some plans, but we'll see.
Well, Brett, you've been 2.5 years as the kind of the new CEO.
Right.
Not only is it impossible to fill the shoes of the founder,
right.
you know, but it's necessary for this next generation of leadership, because guys our age, you know, we relate to men probably differently, not on a personal level. Everybody needs to be matured in their walk of faith,
right.
discipled. Everybody needs that. But the ways of doing that for guys of your generation are going to be different in the future.
Sure.
What are some of the differences you see that need to be developed for Man in the Mirror ministries that haven't fully developed yet?
Yeah, well, first of all, I had a 16-year internship at Man in the Mirror before I became the president. So my predecessor was David Delk, who I'm standing on his shoulders and Pat's shoulders, and I think I think there's the phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And what I see in the younger generations is in some ways really no different. They crave community, they crave relationship. It probably looks a little bit different, but it's not different in the sense that men want to be connected. They want to have a bigger vision. They want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And I think the world has really this generation looks at the history of maybe their fathers and grandfathers. The average, 25 or 30 years ago, the average job was 25-year career. Yeah. Now it's 3 to 4 years, and then you're moving on to the next thing and moving on to the next thing. Yeah. So I think in the midst of that tumult, that's just how society is right now. People working 2 and 3 jobs to make a full-time job sometimes in their younger years. Really what they need is connection and relationship.
Yeah. I've got to ask you the question that's hanging out there for the culture that is so radically changing right now with this whole gender thing. There's this kind of amorphous, let's not land on a gender right away.
Yeah.
And this is a men's ministry, and there's an assumption that men do have a role.
Sure.
That men do have a particular wiring that needs to be addressed personally, and so let me ask. I'll ask you in turn, Pat. When you first started with Man in the Mirror, the book, and then kind of the focus on our particular gender, you knew there were needs that were unique. What were some of those gender approaches that were particular to our wiring or many of our wirings?
Yeah. Well, let me say these are generalizations, and we use generalizations because they're generally true, but not always true. And then I'd also say that these are not needs that women don't have. It's just that men have these needs. These are the things that are really troubling men. I'm not saying these are not troubling women too. And in fact, I had an angry female reporter do a telephone interview with me one time, and she was so upset that we were a men's ministry. And I said to her, and I forget her name now, but I said, well, let's just call her Angie. I really believe that our ministry exists because of the prayers of all those grandmothers, mothers, wives, and sisters who for decades, in some cases, have been praying that someone would send some help for the men in their lives that seem to satisfy her. Yeah. But as we're looking at what men need, in fact, I wrote one of my books focuses on these 7, let's call them inner aches and pains, because we see this all the time. Out here on the road, we're at TV 45, right here on Interstate 4 in Lake Mary, Florida, and right out here on this interstate right now, there are thousands and thousands of men today who are driving up and down that interstate to and from work, and they are thinking, they have these 7 inner aches and pains. Number 1, I just don't feel like anybody cares about me personally. Not really. Now, as I said, women feel that way too, but there's a unique heat signature that a male leaves when he feels that way. I don't feel like God cares about me personally, not really. I don't feel like my life has a purpose, feels random. I have these destructive behaviors that keep dragging me back down. My soul feels dry. I don't feel like my most important relationships are healthy, marriage, kids, so forth. And then finally, I just don't feel like I'm doing anything that's going to make a difference and leave the world a better place. And so these are a lot of, these are psychological as well as relational and emotional needs, but they're all at the core spiritual needs. And so we like to say, no matter how, and so that man is driving up and down this road every day, and eventually that leads to boredom, depression, stress, whatever. And he's looking over here at this TV station every now and then. He said, I wonder if that would be a place where I could get some answers. And so we're trying to help connect those men to the people and the places, especially churches. We work with churches where they can get the help that they really need.
That's really good.
Yep.
But when you're working with churches, what do you help them do?
Yeah, you know, most churches have what I would sort of call a throw it up against the wall and see what sticks mindset or approach. They didn't do that on purpose. They sort of started with a couple things here and there. It's often built around the passions of the people that are there, which is great. So it's organic. But a lot of churches just don't have an intentional, strategic approach with their men. And interestingly enough, they do have that with their youth and their children, and even their women's ministry sometimes has a really intentional approach. So I think the first thing that we really do is help leaders who really, really want to disciple men. There's been pancake breakfast forever, right? So there are people that want to disciple men,
right?
But they just don't know how to do it. And in addition, what you have is in the typical church, it's a layman who's responsible for men's discipleship or the men's ministry. And so that guy's got his job, his marriage, his kids, his hobbies, and then out of the little sliver that's left over, he's trying to run the men's ministry in the church. And so he Googles, men's ministry or men's Bible study, and picks one of the top 5 things and downloads some stuff or orders some books and goes, man, I'm glad we figured that one out. And meanwhile, he's reaching the same 15% of the men that will come to everything anyway.
Right.
And so I think one of the big things that we do is we help give them an intentional approach. We broaden their horizon to really think about the other 85% of their men.
Right.
And the other thing I think that's unique that we do is we help them realize that men's discipleship doesn't only happen in a male-only context.
Right.
That if, for instance, if a guy has to choose between a couples group and a men's group, and he only has time for one, we'll say go to the couples group. His marriage is probably causing him the most amount of strife in his life anyway. Let's get that under God's under the lordship of Christ first, and then we'll worry about this other stuff.
Pat, I remember when you came, when I was pastoring a local church, Man in the Mirror came in and helped us kind of see the comprehensive view. Right. Because men's ministry tends to just kind of get us in a channel or a lane. But one of the things you said, or maybe it was you, was that this is not about the 15% of the guys that just want to get with other guys.
Right.
This is about your whole life.
Right.
And this isn't just about, getting trained as a guy to have a personal relationship with Jesus. This is about all of your relationships.
Right.
And so I guess my question would be, how does a local church think in terms of men's ministry benefiting the entire congregation rather than it just being a local gender club, where you just do guy things?
Yeah, we do a training called No Man Left Behind, and that we help churches with. And at the beginning of the training, we sort of give a little postulate. We say, is there any way we're going to get the world right if we don't get the church right? And if we're going to get the church right, we have to get families right. If we're going to get families right, we have to get marriages right. And if we're going to get marriages right, we have to fix all the women. No, most of the time, if you're going to get marriages right, most of the time it's a guy who's maybe caught up in the rat race or has a father wound or has an addictions or whatever those issues are. If we can help that guy really find his identity in Christ, become a passionate follower of Jesus Christ, that's going to help his marriage, that's going to help his family, that's going to help the church and the community and the culture, really. So I think that's one of the things, we just give them that perspective that discipling men isn't some He-Man women haters club.
Yeah, right.
Really, discipling men is the best thing we can do for our wives, the best thing we can do for our kids. Let's get godly men, servant leaders. Men whose desire is to love their wives and love their kids and lead them towards Christ.
Pat, you once said, I heard you say one time that an organization will produce exactly what it's designed to produce. And I know you're visionary, but I know you also do think in systems. And so I was sitting there just as a pastor going, So the problem may not be in our aspirations; it's in our design. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes, and so it's there is a statement. Excuse me, and I don't know where it comes from. Nobody knows where it comes from. I've read books and books trying to figure out where this came from. But the statement is this: your system is perfectly designed to produce the results you're getting. So when used in manufacturing, it means if every third car that rolls off the assembly line goes 100 feet and the front bumper is falling off, your system is perfectly designed to produce that result. Well, we've co-opted that for the church, and just the idea in asking church leaders to think about this, that your discipleship system in the church, or discipleship method in the church, is perfectly designed to produce the kinds of men that you have sitting in your pews. In other words, it's not the men's fault. Now, you have to caveat here that you can only work with willing men, but when you introduce discipleship using No Man Left Behind concepts, which are really, we shouldn't even say it's biblical concepts of making disciples, what happens is there are these innovative men, these early adopters, and what happens, in fact, we did some research in 2010, and we found that churches using these concepts, and it's not a curriculum. Use your own curriculum. We don't care. We have curriculum, but use your own curriculum. It's not a curriculum. It's a process. It's a system. It's a model that's perfectly designed to produce men who love God and love their families and communities. And 80 churches using this model. We did some research in 2010, and we found that they were experiencing an average of 48% more men attending their church in 2.5 years.
Wow.
Well, that can't be true.
Wow.
But not only that, they also those same churches saw an 84% increase in the number of men engaged in discipleship. Well, that can't be true either. But as it turned out, we had it verified by some PhD types, and then we knew we had been given a trust by God. So we had the iPhone for men's discipleship, and so we basically felt 1 Corinthians 4:2 is one of our big verses. Now, to whomever has been given a trust, they must prove faithful. And so one of the big questions we ask all the time is, what does faithful look like? What does faithful look like? So we had these concepts, and we started asking, well, what does faithful look like? And we felt after 3 weeks of praying and fasting that God wanted us to try to proliferate these ideas to as many churches as might be interested, and that's where Brett comes in.
That's awesome. Let me go from the system to the personal, okay? Because I know in Pat's story and my story too, the relationships that we had when we were beginning meant everything, you know, as far as, the sustainability of the growth of our faith and so on. So tell us about your story.
Yeah, so I'm the
full disclosure. You're from Boston, right?
I'm from Boston.
Patriots
Go
fan.
Pats, yeah.
Full
and
disclosure.
Sox and
Okay,
Bruins
right.
and Celtics.
All right.
And I think there's a soccer team there too. So I grew up in the church. I was the family that we couldn't Dad, can we please go? I jokingly tell people we had the alarm codes for the church, because it felt like we're always the last one out. So I grew up in the church. We were there when the doors were open. My dad and mom both. My dad was a navigator early on, like when, helped start Christianity Today and Nav Press. I'm way back, as just on the front lines. And so I have godly parents. It's not a typical story. Very godly parents that brought me up in the church. And then I went to college and into sort of liberal la land. And interestingly enough, a fraternity saved me. So I get into this, I'm really not walking with Christ, and I get into this fraternity with these guys, and a fascinating thing happened. I had a group of guys that loved me, that took care of me. I had a crisis. My dad had a health crisis, and I was really, struggling, and they rallied around me. If you're studying late at night, you could always find a buddy to sit up with you, and sometimes distract you, sometimes just be there with you. When you took a class and you had a older brother that had taken the class before, they'd help you with their notes or tell you which professors to avoid, those kinds of things. And so this brotherhood, in a real way, is for me a picture of what discipleship should look like in the church. That men should, a disciple maker is a man who loves and cares about another man enough to help point him towards Christ and go along on the journey with him. And so that was my experience in college. I married a preacher's daughter, and so we sort of journeyed back to Christ together, moved down here and went to your church. And so you were a huge influence on our lives. And I ended up helping to start a software company, and things went sideways again. I got caught up in the rat race. I got caught up in traveling all the time and all that stuff. And a group of guys invited me to read a book called The Man in the Mirror. And so guys that pulled me into that group, including Kevin, and we just bonded together. It was the first time I'd had that same experience, and so that really brought me back into an authentic walk again. And then the next thing I know, my software company goes out of business, and I go interview for a job at Man in the Mirror.
That's awesome.
So that was 18 years ago.
Oh my goodness! You've seen some changes in those 18 years, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Pat, you are again a significant leader in our community, and you've had a lot of relationships. You haven't been stuck in just one organization. You have a broad relationship throughout the city. You've done your Bible study since, am I thinking 91?
1986.
Oh, that's right, 1986. You started that Bible study, and it's still going on today.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
The best place to be on a Friday morning.
It's fantastic. It's a fantastic Bible study, and I love
You've
the guys.
been there.
Yeah, I love the guys you got in there.
In
they're
fact,
terrific.
one of our men was talking about the fact he could remember something you said, and you haven't been there many years now, but he remembers something you said, Jim, Angelakos, this week.
That's frightening, but
it ought to be encouraging. Finally, somebody
was a good thing.
Finally, somebody can repeat something I said.
The sustainability of that, again, we're in an age where we understand how important it is to be faithful in what you're doing throughout the years. And because there's always the temptation to quit or go on to something, so on and so forth. How have you done it all these years?
It's real simple. I'm task-oriented. I know you are too. But I learned early on that in the Asian culture, when they have a problem, they approach it differently than in Western and American culture. So when Americans, we have a problem, and we say, okay, well, how do we fix it? The Asians, the Chinese, ask a different question. They ask the question, what are the relationships that we need to put into place to solve this problem? And those are sympathetic ideas, but the starting point and the emphasis and the priorities is what's really different. And so I learned this early on. I built the real estate business around relationships, and I learned a little sentence. Your viewers, you're going to love this. You can trick yourself if you're task oriented. You can trick yourself into being more relationship oriented with this sentence. It struck me one day, the relationship is the task.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and so
especially,
so we really put a tremendous emphasis on long-term relationships at our Bible study. The other thing, and this is the glue, we don't have any deadwood in leadership. Most informal organizations have no exit strategy for when somebody's calling or interest changes. We have a 1-year job description. You sign up for 1 year, and at the end of every year, if you want to continue, you have to rate your faithfulness in 9 major areas. Number 4 is very faithful. Number 3 is mostly faithful. Number 2 is somewhat faithful. And number 1 is not faithful. And so instead of having leaders hang on for years and everybody's mad at everybody at the end, when a leader's calling changes, we have a way to surface that, celebrate his departure, and then put somebody in who's really passionate.
I love it. Let me.
So I'm systems. I'm systems.
Absolutely.
We are out of time. I hate this, but especially when we get to the relationship part, because that's our faith. Our faith is about a relationship with God, and He made us for relationships. And so, if you're interested, you'll see on the banner where you can contact this relationship or centered ministry. I want to thank Pat Moeller and Brett Clemmer for being here. They're doing wonderful work. And I want you to remember that these discussions are just that. They're discussions among us. We really enjoy one another. We'd love to see you continue the discussions at home and go one step further. Get involved. Because when power talks, you're empowered through the voice of truth. See you next time.
You just watched Power Talks, a Good Life 45 original production that makes you part of our Hope Team here on Good Life 45, where hope happens.